There are places around the world where history is still hiding in plain sight. A forgotten capital buried beneath a farmer's field. A village swallowed by desert sand. Temples built with towers no one could enter. Ancient cities hidden beneath forests and farmland. And enormous stone structures scattered across deserts that researchers still struggle to understand. Tonight, we're traveling across Egypt, Europe, Asia, and the Americas to uncover these forgotten places, and the remarkable stories left behind by the people who built them. Some were abandoned, some were buried, some were deliberately destroyed, and others simply disappeared beneath the landscapes that once surrounded them. Make sure to subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Quick question before we start. Do you know how people fell asleep before melatonin existed? I wrote a whole book on it, 22 Ancient Rituals, $9.99 right now. Links below. Now, let's begin our journey into the forgotten world of the past. The lost capital found in a farmer's field. In the fields of northern Egypt, a farmer was working the land when something unexpected appeared beneath the soil. Ancient stone. Then another piece, and another. What seemed like an ordinary field was hiding the remains of a forgotten royal city. This was Tanis, a once powerful capital of ancient Egypt that had been buried beneath the landscape for centuries. Tanis lies in the northeastern Nile Delta, far from the Great Pyramids of Giza. But during the later periods of ancient Egyptian history, this city became one of the most important places in the country. Kings ruled from here. Temples were built, and enormous monuments were raised in honor of the Egyptian gods. Yet eventually, Tanis disappeared from the center of Egyptian history. The city became especially important during the 21st dynasty, around the 11th century BC. Egypt was no longer controlled from a single powerful center in the way it had been during earlier periods. The north and south were increasingly divided, and Tanis became the political center of kings ruling from the delta. The rulers of Tanis wanted their city to look like a royal capital. They built enormous temples, raised statues, and reused stone from much older monuments. Some of the material found at Tanis had originally been created centuries earlier, during the Great Age of the New Kingdom. This reuse of ancient stone created a strange archaeological puzzle. Fragments bearing the names of famous pharaohs appeared throughout Tanis, even though those rulers had never actually built the city. Blocks from earlier monuments had been transported here, sometimes from places hundreds of kilometers away. The later kings were effectively rebuilding their capital with pieces of Egypt's older history. At the heart of Tanis stood a huge temple dedicated to Amun, surrounded by massive walls and monumental structures. Only fragments survive today, but the scale of the ruins reveals how important the city once was. Colossal statues, obelisks, columns, and decorated stone blocks filled the sacred complex. Then came one of the greatest archaeological discoveries at Tanis. In the early 20th century, excavations revealed a hidden royal cemetery. Inside, archaeologists discovered the remains of several ancient kings. One of them was Psusenes I, a ruler of the 21st dynasty. The discovery was extraordinary. Psusenes had been buried in a silver coffin, a remarkably valuable object in ancient Egypt. Silver was far rarer than gold in Egypt, making the coffin an extraordinary expression of royal wealth. Inside the burial chamber, the king was protected by an elaborate funerary mask and surrounded by objects created for the afterlife. The burial had survived for more than 3,000 years, but it had not been untouched. The tomb had been disturbed at some point in antiquity, yet enough remained for archaeologists to reconstruct an astonishing picture of royal burial during a period that had once been considered relatively obscure. Suzanne's burial mask is particularly striking. It shows the traditional image of an Egyptian king, the face idealized, the eyes carefully shaped, and the royal headdress marking his position. But beneath that mask was the preserved body of a real ruler, a king who had ruled Egypt from a city that would eventually disappear from memory. The discovery changed how historians viewed this period of Egyptian history. The rulers of Tanis had often been overshadowed by the famous pharaohs of earlier centuries, but the treasures found in their tombs demonstrated that the later kings still possessed enormous wealth, craftsmanship, and political power. Tanis also reveals something unusual about how ancient Egyptians treated their own past. The city's builders were surrounded by monuments from earlier generations, and instead of leaving those stones where they had originally stood, they transported them, reassembled them, and incorporated them into their new capital. Ancient Egypt was literally rebuilding itself with pieces of its own history. Imagine Tanis when it was still alive. The delta landscape would have been very different. Temple walls would have risen above the city. Priests would have moved through the sacred precincts. Workers would have transported stone. And royal officials would have managed the affairs of the kingdom. The city would have been crowded with activity. But the environment of the Nile Delta was always changing. Rivers shifted, channels disappeared, and political centers moved. Tanis gradually lost its importance. The city declined, its monuments collapsed, and many of its stones were buried beneath layers of soil. For centuries, the ancient capital remained largely forgotten. The great temples disappeared beneath the landscape, while agriculture continued around the ruins. To someone standing there generations later, there was little indication that a royal capital had once occupied the fields. Then archaeologists began uncovering the remains. Stone by stone, the ancient city returned. Statues emerged from the soil, temple walls appeared, and eventually, the royal tombs revealed treasures that had survived for thousands of years. The chariot decorated with monsters and human faces. In the countryside of southwestern Spain, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient settlement that had been deliberately buried beneath a massive mound of earth. Inside, they found something extraordinary. A ceremonial building, strange sculptures, animal remains, and evidence of a final ritual that ended with the destruction of the entire complex. This is Casas del Terruñuelo, one of the most remarkable archaeological sites connected with the ancient Tartessian world. The site lies in the province of Badajoz, near the modern town of Guarenya. The settlement dates to around the 5th century BC, a period when communities in the southwestern Iberian Peninsula were developing strong connections with the wider Mediterranean world. The people who lived here were influenced by local traditions, but also by contacts with Phoenician and Greek cultures. Casas del Terruñuelo was not simply an ordinary settlement. The excavated building contains an enormous central courtyard, a monumental staircase, and evidence of carefully organized ceremonial activity. The architecture is surprisingly sophisticated. Large earthen walls, stone foundations, and carefully constructed spaces reveal a community capable of major building projects. Then, archaeologists discovered something even stranger. Beneath the remains of the building, they found the bodies of numerous animals. Horses, cattle, pigs, and dogs had been deliberately killed and placed within the complex. The arrangement suggests that this was not an accidental accumulation of animal remains. Something deliberate had taken place here. The discovery raised an important question. Why would an entire community kill so many animals and then bury them beneath a monumental building? The evidence points toward a major ritual, perhaps a ceremony connected with the abandonment of the site, or a religious event that marked the end of its use. But the exact meaning remains uncertain. Then came another extraordinary discovery. In the remains of the building, archaeologists found fragments of a remarkable bronze object. It appears to have been part of a ceremonial chariot. The surviving pieces reveal elaborate decoration, including strange creatures and human-like faces. The imagery is unlike anything that would have been expected from a simple vehicle. Monstrous figures, decorative faces, and carefully worked bronze elements suggest that the chariot had a symbolic purpose. It may have been connected with religious ceremonies, processions, or the display of elite power. The chariot was not simply a means of transportation. Its decoration would have made it immediately noticeable. Imagine bronze surfaces catching the sunlight, strange creatures appearing across the structure, and human faces staring from the decorated panels. The object would have been designed to attract attention. The imagery also reveals the cultural connections of the people who created it. The ancient communities of southwestern Iberia were not isolated. They traded with Mediterranean peoples, encountered foreign artistic traditions, and incorporated outside influences into their own culture. Yet the designs at Casas del Terruñuelo remained distinctly local. The site itself appears to have been carefully planned. A large staircase leads down toward the central courtyard, creating a dramatic transition into the main ceremonial area. The staircase is one of the most impressive surviving examples of ancient monumental architecture in the region. It would have allowed groups of people to move between different levels of the building. But then, The entire complex was deliberately destroyed. The building was burned. Its remains were covered, and the site was sealed beneath a massive mound. This was not simply abandonment. Someone appears to have intentionally buried the place. Why? That remains one of the greatest mysteries of Casas del Turuñuelo. Perhaps the community wanted to close the sacred space permanently. Perhaps the destruction formed part of a ritual. Or perhaps the settlement was abandoned during a period of political or social upheaval. The archaeological evidence cannot yet provide one definite explanation. Whatever happened, the destruction had an unexpected consequence. By covering the building with earth, the ancient inhabitants created a protective layer over everything inside. Centuries passed, then more than 2,000 years. The remains stayed beneath the mound, protected from much of the later development of the landscape. When archaeologists began excavating the site, they slowly uncovered the buried architecture. Walls appeared. The enormous staircase emerged, and the remains of the ritual deposits began to reveal themselves. Every layer provided another clue. The gold tongues placed inside the dead. Along the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, archaeologists recently uncovered something extremely unusual inside ancient tombs. Small pieces of gold, shaped like human tongues. They had been placed inside the mouths of the dead, more than 2,000 years ago. The discovery was made at Marina El Alamein, the remains of an ancient coastal city where Egyptian and Mediterranean traditions came together. The latest excavations revealed 18 ancient tombs, dating mainly to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Some were cut directly into the rock, while others were constructed from limestone above the ground. Inside were human remains, pottery, amphorae, oil lamps, stone objects, and other items associated with burial. But among the most unusual discoveries were the thin gold pieces found around the mouths of the deceased. They were not real tongues covered in gold. They were carefully shaped pieces of gold foil, created to resemble a tongue, and their placement was deliberate. The ancient Egyptians believed that the dead needed to remain capable of speaking in the afterlife. A golden tongue could symbolically give the deceased the ability to speak, especially when facing the gods. This belief was connected with the journey after death. According to Egyptian religious traditions, the deceased would eventually face judgment before Osiris, the god associated with the dead and the afterlife. Being able to speak, to identify oneself, and to communicate was therefore extremely important. The tiny gold tongue represented that ability. Gold itself carried a special meaning. Egyptians associated the metal with the divine because it did not tarnish or decay like ordinary materials. It could therefore be used in funerary objects connected with the gods, eternity, and the preservation of the deceased. A small piece of gold could carry an enormous symbolic meaning. The discoveries at Marina El Alamein are especially interesting because of the period in which they were made. This was not the Egypt of the Great Pyramids, nor the age of the famous pharaohs of the New Kingdom. The tombs belonged to a much later world, when Egypt was deeply connected with Greek and Roman culture. Marina El Alamein was the ancient city of Lucaspes, a coastal settlement positioned within the wider Mediterranean trading world. Ships could move along the coast. Goods arrived from distant regions, and different cultures interacted within the same city. The burial practices reflect that mixture. The tombs themselves contain a combination of traditions. Egyptian religious ideas appear alongside architectural and artistic influences from the wider Mediterranean world. This makes the site particularly valuable because it shows that ancient Egyptian culture did not simply disappear under foreign rule. Instead, it adapted. The gold tongues are a good example. The idea of protecting the dead through Egyptian funerary rituals continued, but the practice developed within a society that was increasingly multicultural. People could participate in several cultural traditions at the same time. Their tombs became places where those traditions met. One of the newly uncovered burial areas also contained a large granite sarcophagus, along with other objects connected with the deceased. Nearby, archaeologists discovered pieces of sculpture, lamps, ceramic vessels, and other objects that help reconstruct the burial environment. Each discovery adds another small piece to the story, but the gold tongues remain the most striking. Imagine opening a tomb after nearly 2,000 years and finding a tiny golden object lying where someone's mouth had once been. It is small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, Yet it represents an entire belief about what happens after death. The practice was not limited to Marina El Aman. Similar golden tongue amulets have been discovered elsewhere in Egypt, including other sites associated with the Greco-Roman period. That suggests this was part of a broader funerary tradition, rather than a completely isolated practice. But the exact meaning may not have been identical for every burial. Not every person received the same objects. And the presence of gold does not automatically tell us the exact social position of the deceased. The complete burial context matters. The tomb, the body, the objects, and the arrangement all have to be considered together. That is one reason archaeology can be so revealing. A tiny object can tell us something about beliefs, but the surrounding evidence tells us how those beliefs were actually practiced. At Marina El Aman, the gold tongues appear alongside other funerary objects, giving researchers a much broader picture of life and death in this ancient coastal community. The city itself was eventually abandoned. Trade routes changed, political powers shifted, and the importance of Lucasbees declined. The buildings deteriorated. The cemetery fell silent, and the people who once lived here disappeared from the landscape. For centuries, the tombs remained sealed beneath the ground. The gold survived, the stone survived, and some of the fragile objects remained protected inside the burial chambers. Then, modern excavations began opening these hidden spaces again. The forgotten Christian town of Dakhla Oasis, deep in the Egyptian desert, far from the Nile Valley. An ancient town lies hidden among the palms and sand. Its streets, its houses, its churches, and even the remains of everyday life have survived beneath the desert. This is Dakhla Oasis, a remote landscape where a Christian community once built a town in one of the harshest environments in Egypt. Dakhla lies far to the west of the Nile, surrounded by vast stretches of desert. Today, the oasis is known for its palm groves and small settlements. But thousands of years ago, its natural springs made it possible for communities to survive here. Water was everything. Without it, there could be no farms, no villages, and no permanent settlement. By the Roman and Byzantine periods, the oasis had become an important part of Egypt's desert network. Small communities were connected by roads, agricultural fields surrounded the settlements, and local people produced crops in the fertile areas around the springs. The desert was not empty. It was a landscape filled with movement and life. One of the most fascinating settlements was Kelis, an ancient town that flourished during the Roman period and continued into the early Christian era. Archaeologists uncovered houses, storage areas, workshops, and religious buildings. The remains provide an unusually detailed look at how ordinary people lived far from Egypt's major cities. The houses were built mainly from mud brick, a practical material in a desert environment. Rooms were arranged around courtyards, with spaces used for cooking, storage, sleeping, and everyday work. Some buildings were surprisingly large, showing that certain families had considerable resources. Then, the religious landscape began to change. Christianity spread through Egypt, and communities in the oasis gradually adopted the new faith. Kelis eventually became home to several Christian churches. Their remains are among the most important discoveries at the site. The churches were not enormous cathedrals. They were relatively modest buildings, constructed from mud brick, with carefully planned interiors. Yet their presence tells us something important. Christian communities were not limited to Egypt's great cities. The religion had reached deep into the desert. Archaeologists also discovered evidence of religious life inside ordinary homes. Small objects, inscriptions, and fragments connected with Christian worship were found among the domestic remains. This suggests that religious belief was becoming part of everyday life, not simply something practiced inside churches. But perhaps the most fascinating discoveries are the ordinary ones. Fragments of clothing, wooden objects, tools, pottery, seeds, and written documents survived because of the extremely dry climate. The desert preserved things that would normally disappear completely. Some of the written material gives us glimpses into everyday concerns. People wrote about property, business, family matters, religious beliefs, and practical problems. These documents bring the ancient residents of Dakhla much closer to us. They were not simply names in history. They were people managing homes, working, trading, and raising families. Agriculture was essential. The inhabitants cultivated crops in the fertile oasis, using water from natural springs and carefully managed irrigation systems. Grain, dates, grapes, and other crops could be grown in the desert environment. The oasis became an island of agriculture, surrounded by an enormous sea of sand. Life was not always easy. Water systems required maintenance, fields depended on reliable supplies, and the desert environment could be unforgiving. A community could survive only if its people maintained the delicate balance between water, agriculture, and settlement. Over time, that balance became more difficult. The reasons for the eventual abandonment of Kelis are complicated and probably involved several factors. Changes in water availability, environmental conditions, economic pressures, and wider political changes may all have contributed. The town was gradually abandoned. Houses were left behind, churches fell silent, and fields were no longer maintained in the same way. The people moved elsewhere, leaving their buildings exposed to the desert. And then, the sand began to take over. Mud brick walls collapsed, rooms filled with dust, and the settlement slowly disappeared beneath the landscape. The intact pot buried beneath a forgotten mission. In a quiet patch of woodland in Florida, archaeologists were searching beneath the soil of an old Spanish mission. They expected to find fragments, broken pottery, small objects, and traces of buildings that had disappeared centuries ago. Instead, they uncovered something almost unbelievably well preserved, a small clay pot, still completely intact after nearly 400 years. This was Mission San Francisco de Potano, a forgotten 17th century mission built among the Potano people of northern Florida. The mission was established in 1606, when Spanish authorities sent a Franciscan friar to a Potano community in the region. The Potano were part of the larger Timucua-speaking world of northern Florida. Their communities had already existed here long before the arrival of the Spanish. The mission therefore brought two very different traditions into the same landscape. At its height, the settlement may have been home to several hundred Potano people, but there was apparently only a single European living at the mission. The Franciscan friar responsible for the religious community. Around them, there would have been houses, cooking areas, workspaces, and the everyday activity of a large indigenous village. The mission was part of a much larger Spanish effort. Over the 17th century, more than 100 Catholic missions were established across Spanish Florida. They were intended to spread Christianity, but they were also closely connected with Spanish colonial administration. For the indigenous communities, life within this system could be complicated. Traditional practices continued, while new religious and political pressures entered the community. Archaeologists have found evidence of this cultural meeting place beneath the forest. Excavations have revealed the remains of a 17th century kitchen, a friar's residence, and parts of the surrounding Potano village. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the site. Together, they provide a detailed glimpse into daily life at the mission. Then, in 2026, something particularly unusual was discovered. Students working with archaeologists uncovered a small clay vessel buried beneath the ground. It was not broken into dozens of fragments. It was still intact, after nearly 4 centuries underground. The little pot had survived almost completely whole. The vessel appears to have been made by an indigenous Potano person. Its exact purpose is still uncertain, and its simple appearance makes the discovery even more interesting. It is not a spectacular royal object. There are no precious stones, no elaborate metalwork, no inscription naming its owner. It is simply a small clay pot. But that simplicity is exactly what makes it valuable. Most archaeological pottery is discovered broken. Over centuries, soil pressure, agricultural activity, construction, and natural movement usually reduce vessels to fragments. Finding an entire pot in its original archaeological setting is much rarer. At San Francisco de Potano, the intact vessel provides archaeologists with something far more useful than a collection of broken pieces. Its position beneath the soil also matters. Archaeologists do not study an artifact only by looking at the object itself. They study where it was found, what was around it, and which layers of soil surrounded it. That context can reveal when an object was made, how it was used, and what was happening in the area when it was deposited. The pot appears to date to the period when the mission was operating. That means someone living in this community may have shaped the vessel around 400 years ago, used it, and eventually left it in the ground. We do not know why it was buried, perhaps. It was accidentally lost. Perhaps it was deliberately placed there, or perhaps it became buried as the surrounding settlement changed. That unanswered question is part of the fascination. A simple object survived, but the person who made it did not leave an explanation. We cannot know who held it, what they cooked in it, or why it ended up exactly where archaeologists found it. The pot survived, but its story did not. The discovery also helps bring the Patano community into focus. Historical records often concentrate on Spanish officials, missionaries, and colonial authorities, but archaeology can reveal the lives of the indigenous people who lived around them, their pottery tools, food remains, and household objects provide another perspective. Imagine the settlement in the early 17th century, the forest surrounding the village, people moving between houses, fires burning in cooking areas, children growing up in the community, and the Spanish friar carrying out his duties nearby. The mission would not have felt like an archaeological site. It would have been someone's home. The people living there were dealing with a changing world. Spanish Christianity was being introduced, European goods were entering the community, and older Patano traditions continued alongside these new influences. The objects found at the site preserve evidence of that complicated relationship. Eventually, the mission was abandoned. By 1706, San Francisco de Patano was no longer operating as a mission. The buildings disappeared, the community moved or changed, and the evidence of the settlement gradually became hidden beneath the landscape. For centuries, the forest grew over the remains. The wooden structures vanished, the mission buildings collapsed, and the exact location faded from common knowledge. But beneath the soil, thousands of artifacts remained. Archaeological investigations eventually began bringing the settlement back into view. Excavations revealed the locations of buildings, activity areas, and countless objects left behind by the people who lived here. The site became a remarkable record of 17th century life in northern Florida. And now, that little intact pot has added another piece to the story. It does not tell us everything. It does not reveal the name of its maker, or explain why it was buried, but it represents something archaeologists rarely get to see, an ordinary object surviving almost exactly as it was left. The mysterious Roman genius carved in northern Britain. In the cold landscape of northern England, a small carving preserves a strange glimpse of Roman Britain. It is not a statue of an emperor, not a grand monument, and not a famous work of art. Instead, it is a simple carving of a genius, a protective spirit believed by the Romans to watch over a person, household, or place. And its discovery helps reveal how Roman beliefs mixed with local traditions on the northern frontier. Northern Britain was one of the most difficult parts of the Roman Empire to control. Beyond the major towns, the landscape became rougher, the weather became colder, and Roman soldiers lived alongside communities whose traditions were very different from those of the Mediterranean. The frontier was not simply a line on a map. It was a meeting place between different cultures. Roman soldiers brought their gods with them. Temples and shrines appeared beside military settlements, and inscriptions were dedicated to Roman deities, but these religious traditions did not remain completely separate from local beliefs. People adapted them, combined them, and sometimes created new forms of worship. The small genius carving is a reminder of that process. A Roman genius was not necessarily a god in the same way as Jupiter or Mars. The word could describe a protective divine spirit associated with an individual, a family, a community, or a particular place. Every person could have a genius, and important locations could have their own protective spirit as well. This idea became especially important throughout the Roman world. Small figures representing these spirits could be placed in shrines, homes, military buildings, and public spaces. They did not need to be enormous. A small carving could represent something considered powerful and invisible. In northern Britain, such religious objects take on another meaning. Roman soldiers stationed far from their homes would have brought familiar beliefs with them. They lived among local communities, built roads and forts, and interacted with people whose religious traditions were already deeply rooted in the landscape. The frontier therefore became culturally complicated. A Roman soldier might worship a traditional Roman god, while also respecting a local deity. A local person might adopt Roman religious imagery without completely abandoning older beliefs. Over time, the boundaries between these traditions became less clear. The genius carving reflects that wider world. It is a small object, but it represents a much larger question. What did it mean to be Roman in a distant province? Was Roman identity based on language, clothing, military service, religion, or something more complicated? Northern Britain was filled with people from different backgrounds. Soldiers could arrive from distant parts of the empire, including areas of continental Europe and the Mediterranean. They brought their own languages, food, clothing, and religious practices. The forts became multicultural communities. Imagine one of these settlements nearly 2,000 years ago. Roman soldiers moving through the gates, local traders arriving with goods, animals being driven along the roads, and small shrines standing near military buildings. A soldier might stop before a tiny religious carving, make an offering, and continue with his daily duties. There was nothing unusual about small acts of worship. For many Romans, religion was part of everyday life. People prayed for protection, success, health, and safe journeys. A genius could represent the unseen force protecting a person or community, but most of these personal moments disappeared. Wooden shrines rotted, offerings were destroyed, and countless small objects were lost. Stone carvings survived more easily. That is why a small piece of carved stone can sometimes tell us more than a much larger building. The genius itself would once have been recognizable to the people who encountered it. Today, we have to reconstruct its meaning from comparisons with other Roman objects, inscriptions, and the archaeological context in which it was discovered. The carving cannot tell us who made it, or exactly who worshipped it. That uncertainty is part of the fascination. Was it created by a Roman soldier, a local craftsman, or someone who had adopted Roman religious traditions? Was it connected with a military unit, a household, or a particular place? The evidence does not answer every question. Yet the carving still reveals something important. Roman Britain was not simply Rome transplanted into England. The culture that developed here was different. Roman ideas interacted with local traditions, creating a frontier society unlike either the Mediterranean world or pre-Roman Britain. The northern frontier was also a dangerous place. Conflicts between Roman communities beyond the frontier could erupt, and soldiers stationed in the region lived with the possibility of violence. Religious protection may therefore have felt especially important. A small protective spirit could carry real emotional significance. Eventually, Roman rule in Britain came to an end. The army withdrew, military settlements declined, and the religious world of Roman Britain disappeared. The shrines became abandoned, the offerings stopped, and the people who once understood the symbols were gone. Centuries passed. The Roman roads remained in the landscape, ruined forts became buried beneath fields, and small objects disappeared into the soil. The genius carving survived quietly, separated from the world that gave it meaning. Today, it is easy to look at a small Roman carving and see only an archaeological artifact. But it was once something more personal. Someone made it, someone looked at it, and someone may have believed that the invisible force it represented could protect them. The Roman villa hidden beneath Devon farmland, beneath an ordinary field in southwestern England. Archaeologists uncovered something that had been hidden for nearly 16 centuries. A Roman villa, a remarkable mosaic, and an elaborate bathhouse. For generations, the land above it had simply been farmland, but beneath the soil, an unusually wealthy Roman household had left behind a glimpse of a very different world. The villa lies near Halberton and Samford Peveril in Devon, an area where Roman villas are surprisingly uncommon. The first clues appeared years ago, when archaeological surveys and fieldwalking revealed Roman material beneath the farmland. Later investigations showed that the remains were much more extensive than anyone had expected. Excavations revealed several parts of a substantial villa complex. But the most impressive discovery was beneath the ground. A colorful mosaic floor covering around 12 square meters. Thousands of small stone cubes, known as tesserae, were arranged into intricate patterns. Red, white, and dark blue-gray pieces created the design. At the center, a large roundel contained a flower with overlapping petals. The mosaic was probably installed during the 4th century AD, when Roman Britain was already changing. It may have decorated a reception room, or perhaps a dining space where important guests were entertained. Whatever its exact purpose, the floor was clearly intended to impress. What makes the discovery especially remarkable is its location. This was not Rome, not southern Italy, and not one of the major cities of Roman Britain. It was Devon, at the far western edge of the Roman world. The quality of the mosaic suggests that the people who lived here had considerable wealth. The villa was not simply a comfortable country house. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered an elaborate bathhouse. It contained at least 2 plunge pools, along with painted plaster walls. The remains suggest that the inhabitants had access to the kind of bathing facilities normally associated with wealthy Roman lifestyles. Bathing was an important part of Roman culture. A bathhouse was more than a place to wash. It could be a place to relax, socialize, and spend time away from the main household. The presence of such a building at this Devon villa tells us something about the lifestyle of its inhabitants. They wanted the comforts of Roman culture, even here at the western edge of the empire. Other objects were also recovered. Among them was a small carved gemstone, an intaglio depicting the goddess Victory. There were also items of personal jewelry, a copper alloy bracelet, a silver-plated spoon, Roman pottery, and other objects connected with daily life. These discoveries create a picture of a household with access to expensive goods. The people living here were not necessarily Roman officials. They may have been members of the local elite, people who had adopted aspects of Roman culture, and had enough wealth to build an impressive rural estate. This is one of the most interesting questions raised by the villa. Who actually lived here? We do not know their names, we do not have a complete written account of their lives. But the buildings provide clues. Their home, their bathhouse, their decorated floors, and their possessions all suggest a household of considerable status. Imagine the villa when it was occupied. The mosaic would have been bright and complete, the walls covered with painted plaster, and the bathhouse filled with steam and warm water. Servants could have moved between rooms. Guests might have gathered around the decorated floors, and the surrounding farmland would have supplied the estate. Outside the main building, there appears to have been a much larger complex. Geophysical surveys detected additional structures and features beneath the fields. The villa was therefore probably more than one impressive house. It was part of a wider estate, with buildings and activities spread across the surrounding landscape. The discovery also changes our understanding of Roman Devon. Only a small number of Roman villas are known in the region. Most of the grandest villas in Britain are concentrated farther east and south. Finding such an elaborate complex here shows that Roman-style wealth and architecture reached much farther west than might have been expected. But Roman Britain was already changing when this villa reached its most luxurious phase. During the 4th century, the empire was under increasing pressure. Political power was shifting. Economies were changing. And Roman authority in Britain would eventually come to an end. The villa's final years belonged to a world very different from the one that had created Roman Britain. Eventually, the household disappeared. The buildings were abandoned, the roof collapsed, and the decorated rooms fell silent. The mosaic remained beneath layers of rubble and soil. The bathhouse disappeared, and the fields slowly covered the remains. For around 16 centuries, the land continued to change above the ruins. Generations of farmers worked the fields, probably without realizing how much history lay beneath their feet. Then modern archaeology began to reveal the buried complex. The discovery did not happen all at once. The temples with towers no one could enter. Deep in the forests of Campeche, Mexico, ancient Maya temples rise above the surrounding jungle. At first, they look like enormous stepped pyramids, tall, imposing, and carefully decorated. But there is something strange about them. Some of their tallest towers were never designed to be entered. They had doorways, staircases, and temple entrances, yet behind them was solid stone. These were the false towers of Rio Bec, one of the most unusual architectural traditions of the ancient Maya. The Rio Bec region lies deep within the tropical forests of southern Campeche, far from the major Maya cities most people know. The ancient settlements here developed between roughly the 7th and 9th centuries AD, during a period when Maya architecture was becoming increasingly elaborate. Instead of building simple temples, the architects created structures that looked much larger and more complex than they actually were. The most recognizable feature is the pair of tall towers. They rise on either side of a central building, creating the appearance of enormous pyramid temples. The towers have steep staircases climbing their fronts, and at the top there are temple structures with doorways from a distance. They look completely functional, but they were not. The staircases are too steep to have been practical. They were built at angles that would have made climbing them extremely dangerous, and the doorways at the tops of the towers lead nowhere. Behind the entrances, there is no large interior chamber. The towers are essentially solid structures. They were architectural illusions. That raises an obvious question. Why would the Maya spend enormous amounts of time constructing towers that nobody could actually use? The answer is still debated. Some archaeologists believe the towers were designed to imitate the sacred mountain, a powerful symbol in Maya religion. Others see them as monumental displays of political authority, built to make the rulers and their cities appear more powerful. The towers may also have represented temples belonging to gods, even if nobody physically entered them. The architecture itself could have been the important part. The steep stairs, the false doorways, and the towering height created an impression of something sacred and inaccessible. This was not simply careless construction. The builders knew exactly what they were doing. The towers were carefully planned. Their proportions were deliberate, and their surfaces were covered with elaborate decoration. The illusion was the point. The central buildings were different. Unlike the false towers, some of the central rooms could actually be entered. They contained chambers, doorways, and spaces where ceremonies could take place. This created a strange contrast. At the center, a functioning building on either side. Monumental towers that appeared functional but were largely symbolic. The Riobec style therefore creates a kind of architectural theater. Visitors approaching the buildings would first see the enormous towers. The steep staircases would draw their eyes upward, toward the temples at the top. But the actual ritual spaces remained closer to ground level. The building communicated power before anyone even entered it. The surrounding jungle made the effect even stronger. Imagine approaching one of these structures centuries ago, before the forest reclaimed the site. The towers would have been covered in brightly painted plaster. The carvings would have been much sharper, and the upper temples would have stood dramatically above the settlement. The Maya did not build these monuments in isolation. The Riobec region contained several settlements, and related architectural styles appear across nearby parts of the Maya world. The buildings show connections with wider Maya traditions, while also developing a distinctive local style. The decoration is especially important. Masks representing supernatural beings appear on some structures along with geometric patterns, serpent imagery, and other religious motifs. The architecture was communicating ideas about the supernatural world, not simply providing shelter. One of the most striking examples is Structure 2 at Riobec. Its twin towers dominate the building. While the central section contains the actual rooms, the towers rise far above the rest of the structure, creating the impression of a much larger temple complex. But there is no staircase leading safely into the upper chambers. The steep stairs were constructed more like scenery than practical architecture. They were meant to be seen, not climbed. This makes Riobec different from many other Maya temple complexes. At places such as Tikal, Palenque, or Chichen Itza, the Great Pyramids could be climbed, and their temples served real architectural functions. At Riobec, the appearance of the building was sometimes more important than practical use. That tells us something about Maya society. Architecture could communicate power through symbolism alone. A ruler did not necessarily need people to enter a tower. The tower simply needed to exist. Its height, its decoration, and its imposing appearance could demonstrate the importance of the place. Eventually, the settlements of the Riobec region declined. The reasons are still debated, and probably involved several environmental and social factors. Population patterns changed. Political systems shifted, and the great Maya cities across the region gradually lost their importance. The buildings were abandoned. The painted surfaces weathered. The roofs collapsed, and vegetation slowly covered the stone. The jungle transformed monumental architecture into mounds of earth and trees. For centuries, the false towers disappeared beneath the forest. Modern archaeology eventually revealed the structures again. Researchers cleared vegetation, mapped the buildings, and began understanding the unusual architectural style. The more they studied the towers, the stranger they became. They were not failed temples. They were not unfinished buildings. They were deliberately constructed illusions. The Maya architects had created towers that looked as though they could be entered. The yellow city built above a buried pyramid. In the heart of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, an entire city glows with the same golden color. Yellow walls, yellow churches, yellow streets. And beneath the modern buildings, the remains of an ancient Maya city are still buried beneath the ground. At the center of it all, a massive Maya pyramid rises above the town. This is Izamal, a city where the modern world was built directly over an ancient sacred landscape. Long before the Spanish arrived, Izamal was already an important Maya religious center. The settlement developed around several enormous ceremonial structures, and among them, one pyramid became especially important. It was known as Kinich named after a powerful Maya deity associated with the sun and fire. The pyramid is enormous. Its base covers a huge area, and the structure rises high above the surrounding city. Unlike many Maya pyramids that are surrounded by open archaeological parks, Kinich stands directly beside the modern streets of Izamal. Houses, buildings, and roads surround the ancient monument. The old city and the new city exist almost on top of one another. The name Kinich can be translated roughly as Fire Macaw of the Sun. The deity was imagined as a powerful supernatural being, associated with the blazing strength of the sun. According to Maya tradition, Kinich could descend to earth in the form of a fiery macaw. The pyramid was connected with this powerful figure. The ancient Maya did not choose this location randomly. Izamal was already an important sacred center long before the Great Pyramid was built. Several enormous platforms and temples were constructed across the settlement. The city became a place where people could gather, perform ceremonies, and honor powerful gods. At its height, Izamal was one of the major centers of the northern Maya world. The city contained enormous plazas, elevated platforms, causeways, and monumental buildings. Some structures were connected by raised roads called sakbiob, which allowed people to move through the ceremonial landscape. The Maya did not simply build isolated pyramids. They created entire sacred environments. At Izamal, the monuments were arranged around large open spaces, where ceremonies could take place. The size of the building suggests that the city attracted significant populations, at least during important periods. Then, centuries after the Maya civilization had already developed, another transformation began. Spanish conquerors arrived in Yucatan, and like many Maya sacred sites, Izamal became part of a completely new religious landscape. The Spanish built a massive Franciscan monastery directly on top of one of the ancient Maya platforms. The structure became known as the Convento de San Antonio de Padua. Its enormous open courtyard, known as an atrium, was built over the remains of the Maya monument. This created an extraordinary archaeological situation. A Maya ceremonial platform, a Spanish colonial monastery, and a modern Mexican city now occupy the same landscape. Three different periods of history are literally stacked together. The ancient Maya structures were not completely destroyed. Many were incorporated into the colonial buildings, while others remained visible beside them. Kinich survived more clearly, rising above the modern city as one of the most impressive remains of ancient Izamal. The city itself has another unusual feature. Many of the buildings are painted yellow. The streets, walls, and colonial structures create a distinctive golden appearance. This is why Izamal is often called the Yellow City. But beneath that bright modern appearance, the ancient Maya landscape is still present. Imagine Izamal during the height of the Maya period. There would have been no yellow colonial walls, no Spanish church, and no modern roads. Instead, huge stone temples would have dominated the landscape. Priests, merchants, craftspeople, and farmers would have moved through the city. The pyramid of Kinich would have towered above them. Ceremonies could have taken place around its base, while offerings were made to the deity associated with the monument. The exact rituals are difficult to reconstruct, but the scale of the pyramid tells us that the place was important. The city was also connected with other Maya settlements. Trade routes crossed the Yucatan Peninsula, moving pottery, stone, salt, food, and other valuable goods. Izamal's religious importance likely helped make it an important regional center. But Maya civilization was not static. Political powers changed, cities rose and declined, and populations shifted across the peninsula. Izamal eventually lost much of its earlier influence. The great ceremonial buildings remained, but the world that created them changed. When the Spanish arrived, they encountered an ancient sacred landscape that was still important to the local Maya population. The new rulers transformed it. The monastery became a center of Christian activity, while Maya traditions continued among the local population. The old and new cultures existed side by side. Over time, the ancient city became increasingly buried beneath the growing settlement. Buildings were constructed, streets changed, and parts of the ancient monuments disappeared beneath later layers. But the largest structures were impossible to completely hide. Kinich remained. Its massive stone terraces continued to rise above the surrounding city, a reminder that Izamal was ancient long before the Spanish buildings appeared. The hollow that held the greatest treasure in North America. In the forests of eastern Oklahoma, a low group of ancient earthworks hides one of the most extraordinary archaeological stories in North America. For centuries, the mounds stood quietly above the landscape, but beneath one of them, there was a hollow chamber filled with objects unlike anything archaeologists had seen before. Shell, copper, pearls, carved stone, and beautifully decorated ceremonial objects. This was Spiro Mounds, one of the most important archaeological sites of the ancient indigenous world of North America. Spiro lies along the Arkansas River, near the modern town of Spiro, Oklahoma. The site was occupied roughly between AD 800 and 125 HEMS. During a period when complex societies were developing across the Mississippi Valley, the people who lived here built large earthen mounds, organized ceremonial spaces, and participated in enormous exchange networks. But one particular structure made Spiro famous. It became known as the Craig Mound, although local excavators eventually gave its central chamber another name. Inside the mound, there was a hollow space, a sealed chamber that archaeologists later called the Spirit Lodge, and what was found inside was extraordinary. The chamber contained hundreds of objects, many of them made from materials that had traveled enormous distances: marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from distant regions, obsidian, pearls, and other rare materials were brought together at Spiro. The collection showed that the people connected with this place participated in a vast trading world. Some of the objects were beautifully carved. There were engraved shell gorgets, ceremonial pipes, stone figures, copper ornaments, and objects depicting supernatural beings. The imagery included birds, serpents, warriors, and mysterious human-like figures. Together, they reveal a complex religious tradition. One of the most remarkable discoveries was the collection of engraved shell gorgets. These were circular pieces of marine shell, often worn as ornaments or ceremonial objects. Their surfaces were carefully carved with elaborate designs, including supernatural creatures and powerful symbols. The materials themselves are fascinating. Spiro lies hundreds of kilometers from the ocean, yet marine shell appears throughout the collection. That means people were moving valuable materials across enormous distances. The objects traveled, but so did ideas. Spiro became part of what archaeologists call the Mississippian cultural world, a broad network of indigenous societies that shared certain artistic traditions, religious ideas, and forms of monumental architecture. But these communities were not one single civilization. They were independent societies, connected through trade, diplomacy, and shared cultural traditions. The site itself was carefully organized. Large mounds surrounded open ceremonial areas, while residential areas extended around the central complex. The mounds were built from earth, moved and shaped by human hands. Their construction would have required considerable cooperation. Spiro was not simply a place where people lived. It appears to have been an important ceremonial center. People may have traveled from distant communities to participate in rituals, exchange goods, or interact with powerful religious leaders. The extraordinary objects found inside Craig Mound suggest that the site had influence far beyond its immediate surroundings. The chamber itself appears to have been connected with elite or ceremonial activity. Objects were carefully placed inside, some apparently preserved for generations. The collection was not simply a pile of valuable goods. Many objects appear to have had religious or symbolic significance. Imagine opening the chamber when it was still in use. The interior would have been dark, filled with carefully arranged objects. Shell ornaments would have reflected light. Copper surfaces would have gleamed, and carved figures would have surrounded the people entering the space. For those who created it, this may have been a sacred environment. But the story of Spiro took a tragic turn in modern times. During the 1930s, treasure hunters and amateur excavators began digging into Craig Mound. They were searching for valuable artifacts, and much of the chamber was damaged. The objects were removed from their archaeological context, making it difficult to understand exactly how they had originally been arranged. Some pieces were sold, others disappeared into private collections, and the destruction caused permanent damage to the archaeological record. Eventually, archaeologists became involved. They documented the remaining material, recovered artifacts, and began studying the extraordinary collection. The surviving objects revealed the importance of Spiro, but much of the original context had already been lost. This is one of the great tragedies of archaeology. The objects themselves survived, but the information surrounding them did not. An artifact can tell us what it is made from, but its exact position inside a chamber can reveal who used it, when it was placed there, and what role it played. Once that context is destroyed, part of the story disappears forever. Even so, the surviving collection remains extraordinary. Some objects appear to have traveled from hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. This means Spiro was connected to an enormous network stretching across much of ancient North America. The site also demonstrates the sophistication of indigenous societies long before European arrival. These communities built monumental earthworks, developed complex religious traditions, created highly skilled art, and maintained long-distance exchange networks. The brick temples drowning in rice fields. In the lowlands of western Java, ancient brick structures rise quietly above the rice fields. At first, they look like ordinary mounds of reddish earth, but beneath the grass and farmland, there are temples. Hundreds of years ago, this landscape was part of a powerful ancient kingdom. Today, much of that world is hidden beneath the fields. This is Batu Jaya, one of the most unusual archaeological landscapes in Indonesia. Batu Jaya lies in West Java, near the northern coast. The area is remarkably flat, and today it is dominated by rice cultivation. Farmers work the same landscape where ancient communities once built religious monuments. The contrast is striking. Modern fields surround structures that are more than 1,000 years old. The archaeological complex contains numerous ancient mounds, known locally as Al Unard Bunag. Beneath some of these mounds, archaeologists discovered brick buildings. Several have been identified as Buddhist structures. Although the exact purpose of every monument is not completely understood, the bricks themselves are fascinating. They were made from local clay, then carefully shaped and fired before being used in construction. Some of the surviving walls show remarkably precise brickwork. The builders created large structures without the stone blocks used in many other Indonesian temples. Instead, brick was the material that transformed this landscape. One of the best-known structures is Candi Jiwa. Unlike the towering stone temples of central Java, Candi Jiwa is relatively low and compact. Its surface rises above the surrounding fields, creating a strange island of ancient architecture among the rice paddies. Another important structure is Candi Blandongan. Excavations revealed a substantial brick platform, with architectural features suggesting that it had a religious function. The monument was constructed and modified over time, showing that Batu Jaya was not a settlement built in a single moment. The dating of Batu Jaya is particularly interesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the earliest activity here may date to around the 5th century AD, making the complex significantly older than many of the famous temples people associate with Indonesia. The monuments therefore belong to an early period of Buddhism in the region. This raises an important question. Who built them? The area is associated with the ancient Tarumanagara kingdom, one of the earliest known kingdoms in Western Java. Written inscriptions from the kingdom provide evidence of Hindu traditions, while the archaeological remains at Batu Jaya reveal strong Buddhist connections. The religious landscape appears to have been more diverse than a simple label suggests. Batu Jaya also shows that early religious communities were capable of major construction projects. Bricks had to be produced, transported, arranged, and maintained. Large platforms had to be raised above the surrounding landscape. This required organized labor, technical knowledge, and access to considerable resources. The environment itself may have influenced the architecture. The region is extremely flat, and parts of it are vulnerable to flooding. The ancient builders therefore constructed their monuments on raised platforms. The temples stood above the surrounding ground, creating dry and stable spaces within a wet landscape. Imagine this place more than 1,000 years ago. There would have been no modern rice paddies, no roads crossing the fields, and no distant sounds of modern machinery. Instead, the area would have been occupied by ancient communities. With religious structures rising above the surrounding lowlands, people would have approached the temples, carried offerings, and gathered around the monuments. The temples were not isolated. Archaeological excavations have uncovered pottery, beads, building materials, and other objects around the structures. These discoveries show that Batu Jaya was part of a wider settlement landscape, rather than simply a collection of abandoned temples. Some discoveries have also revealed evidence of contact with distant regions. Objects and cultural influences indicate that Western Java was connected with wider maritime networks. The communities living here were not isolated from the rest of Asia. Trade routes across the seas connected Java with other parts of the ancient world. Buddhism itself had traveled enormous distances before reaching this landscape. Ideas moved along the same networks as merchants and goods, passing between India, Southeast Asia, and the Indonesian archipelago. Batu Jaya became one of the places where those ideas took physical form. But eventually, the monuments were abandoned, the buildings deteriorated, brick walls collapsed, and vegetation gradually covered the structures. The flat landscape changed around them over time. Some of the temples became little more than low mounds. Farmers continued working the surrounding land. Rice was cultivated. Water moved through the fields, and the ancient structures became part of the landscape for generations. People could walk past these mounds without knowing exactly what lay beneath them. Modern archaeological investigations eventually revealed the scale of the site. Excavations uncovered brick walls, platforms, ceremonial structures, and evidence of ancient occupation. What had looked like ordinary earthen mounds turned out to be the remains of a much older world. The Roman concrete that survived for 1,900 years, near the ancient city of Rome, inside the remains of Emperor Hadrian's enormous country villa. Archaeologists examined something most people would never think to study, a piece of concrete, taken from an ancient Roman latrine. It looked ordinary, but beneath its surface, It was preserving a remarkable secret about why Roman concrete could survive for nearly 2,000 years. The structure came from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, a vast imperial complex built during the 2nd century AD. The villa was far more than a simple residence. It contained gardens, pools, libraries, temples, theaters, baths, and enormous underground service structures. It was effectively a small imperial city. Among those structures were Roman latrines. They were practical buildings, designed for everyday use, and unlike famous monuments, they were never considered important enough to receive major restoration. That turned out to be extremely useful for archaeologists. The concrete inside had been left almost completely undisturbed. A sample taken from one of the latrine structures was around 1,900 years old. Researchers examined it using high-resolution X-rays, electron microscopy, and chemical analysis. They were able to look deep inside the material, down to incredibly small scales. And what they found was unexpected. The concrete contained volcanic rock fragments, volcanic ash, and lime. Materials already known to have been important in Roman construction. But inside the tiny pores and cracks, something else had formed: calcite. A mineral made largely from calcium carbonate. Over centuries, carbon dioxide and moisture interacted with calcium-rich material inside the concrete. This process, known as carbonation, gradually produced calcite. And the calcite did something important. It filled tiny spaces inside the concrete. Some of the calcite had also formed within cracks. Instead of leaving those cracks open, mineral growth gradually filled them. The material became denser, reducing pathways through which water and other damaging substances could move, in a sense. The concrete was slowly repairing parts of its own internal structure. This does not mean Roman concrete was completely self-healing. The process was gradual, and it depended on the particular materials and conditions, but it provides an important explanation for why some Roman concrete structures have survived for so long. The material continued changing, even centuries after the Romans had finished building. The volcanic material played another role. The Romans used volcanic ash that could react chemically with lime, creating cement-like compounds. This reaction helped bind the concrete together. The new research suggests that carbonation and calcite formation added another important layer of durability. That combination is particularly interesting. The Romans were not simply pouring ordinary cement into wooden forms. They were creating a complex mixture, using materials that continued interacting with one another long after construction. The finished concrete was not chemically inactive. It continued evolving. Imagine the villa when Hadrian lived there. The complex would have been filled with people: servants, soldiers, officials, guests, and craftsmen. Water flowed through enormous pools and fountains, baths filled with steam, and underground structures carried away waste and water. The concrete had to survive all of it: water, humidity, temperature changes, and constant use. Some of those structures were exposed to extremely demanding conditions. Yet nearly 2,000 years later, their materials can still be examined. The latrine itself is important precisely because it was ordinary. Imperial monuments have often been repaired, rebuilt, or reconstructed over the centuries. A simple service structure was much less likely to receive that attention. Its concrete therefore preserved evidence of how the Romans originally made it. This gives scientists an unusual archaeological record. Instead of studying a restored ancient wall, they could examine material that had quietly aged for 19 centuries. The concrete had essentially conducted its own long experiment. The research also reveals something about Roman engineering. The builders did not understand chemistry in the modern scientific sense, but they had generations of practical experience. They knew which volcanic materials worked, how to combine them with lime, and how to construct structures capable of surviving harsh conditions. That knowledge was incredibly valuable. Roman concrete was used in harbors, baths, bridges, vaults, walls, and enormous buildings. Some of those structures remain standing today. The Pantheon is perhaps the most famous example, but the same broader tradition was used throughout the Roman world. Hadrian's villa itself eventually fell into decline. The emperor died in the 2nd century. Later rulers used the complex, and over the centuries. The buildings were abandoned, marble was removed, statues disappeared, and vegetation slowly covered the ruins. But beneath the collapsed structures, the concrete remained. The walls, foundations, vaults, and underground systems continued to preserve the materials used by Roman builders. The empire disappeared, but its engineering survived. Today, scientists are studying these ancient materials for another reason. Modern concrete has enormous environmental and engineering challenges. If researchers can understand why ancient Roman concrete remained durable, some of those principles could potentially inspire new construction materials. The goal is not simply to copy Roman buildings. It is to understand the chemistry behind their longevity. That makes the tiny sample from the latrine surprisingly important. It came from a place that was never meant to become famous. No emperor was buried there. No major battle happened there. And no great monument stood above it. It was simply part of the infrastructure of an enormous Roman villa. Yet inside that ordinary piece of concrete, scientists found evidence of an extraordinary material. The desert bathhouse covered in ancient paintings. In the middle of the Jordanian desert, a small stone building stands surrounded by empty landscape. From the outside, it looks almost ordinary, but step through its doorway, and the walls reveal something completely different. Painted kings, hunters, animals, naked bathers, and scenes unlike anything else preserved from the early Islamic world. This is Qasr Amra, a remarkable Umayyad bathhouse built more than 1300 years ago. Qasr Amra was constructed during the early 8th century, probably under the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid I or Al-Walid II. It stands east of Amman, in a landscape that today appears almost completely barren. But the building was never intended to stand alone. It belonged to a wider network of desert residences, palaces, water installations, and hunting retreats used by the Umayyad elite. The building itself is relatively small. There is a reception hall, a series of bathing rooms, and spaces connected with heating and water. But the decoration is extraordinary. Almost every available surface inside the main rooms was used for painted decoration. The desert stone walls became a canvas. One of the most famous paintings shows 6 rulers. The figures appear beneath inscriptions identifying them as powerful leaders, including the Byzantine emperor, the Persian ruler, and other contemporary or recently defeated kings. At the center, the Umayyad ruler appears in a position of prominence. The scene seems to communicate political power. The Umayyad world was surrounded by older empires and powerful neighbors by placing their rulers together. The painting may have presented the caliph as a legitimate successor to the great powers of the region. It was political imagery, inside a private desert building. But the paintings are not limited to rulers. Other walls show hunting scenes, animals, plants, and human figures. There are also images of women, musicians, and scenes connected with bathing and leisure. The variety is remarkable. One of the strangest paintings is known as the 6 Kings fresco. Another famous scene shows a female figure emerging from a bath, while other paintings depict a reclining man surrounded by attendants. The imagery is unusually worldly for an early Islamic building. That does not mean the paintings were simply decorative. The Umayyad period was a time of cultural transformation. The new Islamic Empire ruled territories that had previously belonged to Roman, Byzantine, and Persian worlds. Artists and craftsmen continued working within traditions that existed long before Islam. Qasr Amra reflects that mixture. The architecture is Islamic. The building was commissioned by Umayyad rulers, yet the artistic vocabulary includes influences from the classical Mediterranean world, Persia, and the broader Near East. It is a building where different traditions meet. The bathhouse itself was carefully engineered. Water had to be brought into the desert, stored, heated, and circulated through the building. A furnace heated the air beneath the floors, while hot water could be supplied to the bathing rooms. The technology required considerable planning. For the people who used the building, the bath would have been more than a place to wash. It provided relaxation, social interaction, and a temporary escape from the harsh desert environment. The surrounding landscape may have been dry, but inside there was water, heat, painted walls, and controlled comfort. Imagine arriving here in the 8th century. After traveling across the desert, you would see the small stone structure ahead, inside. The air would be warmer, water would be flowing, and colorful paintings would cover the walls. The contrast with the empty landscape outside would have been extraordinary. The building also appears to have been associated with hunting. Hunting was an important activity among the Umayyad elite. It provided entertainment, demonstrated physical skill, and could also symbolize royal power. Animals shown in the paintings may therefore have carried more than simple decorative meaning. The ceiling contains one of the most famous astronomical representations in early Islamic art. A large painted dome depicts the night sky, with constellations arranged across its surface. It is often described as one of the earliest surviving representations of the celestial sphere in Islamic art. Why was the sky painted inside a bathhouse? The exact meaning remains uncertain. It may have been connected with astronomy, royal symbolism, or simply the desire to decorate the space with an image of the heavens. whatever its purpose. It reveals how sophisticated the decoration of Qasr Amra was. Then, the building was abandoned. The reasons are not completely clear. Political changes affected the Umayyad dynasty, and the site eventually lost its original function. The desert slowly surrounded the structure, while dust and sand accumulated inside. For centuries, the paintings remained hidden beneath layers of dirt. The colors faded, the plaster deteriorated, but large sections survived. Eventually, modern archaeological work began documenting the remarkable paintings. Restoration has revealed details that would otherwise have disappeared. The frescoes are now among the most important surviving examples of early Islamic secular art. They provide evidence of a world that is often difficult to reconstruct from written sources alone. Qasr Amra also challenges simple ideas about early Islamic art. The building does not contain only geometric patterns or calligraphy, it contains human figures, animals, rulers, musicians, hunters, and scenes of everyday life. The decoration reflects a much more diverse artistic world. The ancient city designed like a perfect grid along the western coast of modern Turkey. The ruins of an ancient Greek city spread across a broad plain, long streets, regular blocks, public buildings, and carefully planned neighborhoods create a pattern that looks surprisingly modern. This is Miletus, a city whose streets were rebuilt according to one of the most influential urban plans of the ancient world. Miletus stood in ancient Ionia, near the Aegean coast of present-day Turkey, for centuries. It was one of the most important Greek cities in the region. Miletus became famous for trade, seafaring, philosophy, and architecture. But its greatest influence may have been the way its city was organized. Around the 5th century BC, Miletus was rebuilt using a highly regular street system. Streets crossed one another at approximately right angles, creating rectangular blocks. Instead of allowing the city to grow randomly, the planners imposed an organized pattern across the landscape. This became known as the Hippodamian Plan. The name is traditionally associated with Hippodamus of Miletus, an influential Greek thinker and city planner. Ancient writers connected him with the planning of cities, and his ideas became associated with the use of regular grids. But the story is more complicated than simply saying that one man invented the grid. Regular urban layouts existed elsewhere before him. What made the Miletus plan important was the scale at which the idea was applied. The city was divided into organized blocks, with streets running in different directions, and major public spaces incorporated into the overall design. The result was a city that could be planned rather than simply inherited. This was a major change from the irregular streets found in many older settlements. A planned city could separate different functions, create predictable routes, and provide space for public buildings. At Miletus, the grid became the framework around which the city developed, but the plan was not simply about making streets look neat. The city contained different kinds of spaces: residential blocks, market areas, religious buildings, government buildings, and enormous public complexes. The grid provided the structure, while individual buildings gave different parts of the city their purpose. The rebuilding of Miletus followed major destruction. The city had suffered during the Persian Wars, and its political and physical landscape changed dramatically. Reconstruction provided an opportunity to create something different. Instead of simply rebuilding the old streets, the city could be reorganized. Imagine Miletus after the rebuilding began. Surveyors would have marked out lines across the ground, workers would have followed those boundaries, and new buildings would gradually appear inside the planned blocks. The process required considerable organization. Every street had to connect with another, and major buildings had to fit into the overall design. The city's location also mattered. Miletus had access to the Aegean Sea, and developed into an important trading center. Ships arrived with goods, merchants moved through the city, and products traveled between the Greek world and regions farther east. The planned streets supported a busy urban economy. Miletus was also a center of intellectual life. Several early Greek philosophers were associated with the city, including Thales of Miletus. This intellectual tradition became one of the reasons Miletus is so important in the history of ancient Greece. The city was not only wealthy, it was also a place where people questioned how the world worked. The connection between philosophy and urban planning is particularly interesting. The Greek world was increasingly interested in order, measurement, geometry, and rational organization. The grid city reflected some of those same ideas. The landscape itself was being organized according to a system, but the city was not perfectly geometric everywhere. Terrain, existing buildings, and later constructions sometimes interrupted the original plan. The grid was a framework, not an absolute rule. As Miletus developed, new structures were added, modified, or replaced. One of the most impressive surviving areas is the enormous market gate, a monumental entrance to the marketplace. The structure was rebuilt during the Roman period, but it stands within the older planned city. Its scale demonstrates how the original Greek grid continued to support later development. The Romans transformed Miletus. New baths, theaters, public buildings, and monumental structures were added. The city continued to evolve, but the underlying street organization remained visible. Different civilizations therefore built their own layers onto the same urban framework. Eventually, the environment began working against the city. The nearby river carried huge amounts of sediment, gradually pushing the coastline farther away. The harbor that had once connected Miletus directly with the Aegean became increasingly distant. A city built around maritime trade was slowly losing its access to the sea. This environmental change had enormous consequences. Harbors became unusable, trade declined, and the city's importance gradually decreased. Miletus could not simply move the coastline back. The landscape itself was changing. The city was eventually abandoned. Buildings collapsed. Streets became buried, and sediment covered large portions of the ancient settlement. For centuries, the ruins remained surrounded by the changing landscape of the Menderes Plain. Today, the ancient grid can still be recognized. Standing among the ruins, you can trace the lines of streets that were planned more than 2,000 years ago. The buildings have largely disappeared, but the organization of the city remains visible. The forgotten pyramids of Giza, behind the three great pyramids of Giza. Smaller pyramids stand quietly in their shadows. They are easy to overlook, but these monuments belong to queens, royal family members, and important women of ancient Egypt. Together, they reveal another side of the most famous pyramid complex in the world. The Giza Plateau is dominated by the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, but the royal cemetery was much larger than those three monuments. Around them, the ancient Egyptians built smaller pyramids, mastabas, temples, tombs, and causeways. Among these are the so-called Queen's Pyramids, located beside the Pyramid of Khufu. Three main small pyramids stand to the southeast of Khufu's Great Pyramid. They are usually identified as G1A, G1B, and G1C. Their original names are uncertain, and archaeologists have debated which royal women were actually buried within them. They were built during the 4th dynasty, more than 4,500 years ago. The pyramids are much smaller than Khufu's, but they were still major monuments. Each required enormous amounts of stone, organized labor, and careful planning. Their presence shows that royal women could receive monumental tombs within the heart of the royal cemetery. The first pyramid, known as G1A, is often associated with Hetepher's, the mother of Khufu, but the identification is not completely certain. Hetepher's was an important royal woman, and her burial equipment was discovered in a nearby shaft tomb. Yet whether G1A was actually her pyramid remains debated. The second, G1B, has also been connected with a royal woman, possibly Meritite's Eye. She was associated with the royal family during the 4th dynasty. But again, the evidence does not allow archaeologists to state with complete certainty who was buried inside. The third pyramid, G1C, is particularly interesting. Its structure is slightly different, and some researchers have connected it with Henotsen, a wife of Khufu. A small temple was also associated with this pyramid. These uncertainties are important. The pyramids survive, but the people who built them left relatively little direct information, explaining exactly who occupied each monument. Later inscriptions, architectural evidence, and archaeological discoveries must be combined to reconstruct their identities. The Queen's Pyramids also reveal something about Egyptian royal burial practices. A pyramid was not simply a tomb. It formed part of a much larger funerary complex. There were temples, offering areas, and connections to the larger religious landscape of the plateau. The pyramid was only one part of the journey. The dead queen would have been connected with rituals performed after her death. Priests could bring offerings, perform ceremonies, and maintain the cult of the deceased. The monument therefore required people to continue working there long after construction had finished. The smaller pyramids also stood in the shadow of an enormous statement of royal power. Khufu's Great Pyramid originally rose more than 140 meters above the plateau. Beside it, the Queen's Pyramids looked tiny, but their placement was deliberate. They were part of the same royal landscape, connected to the king's monument. Imagine Giza when these pyramids were new. The limestone surfaces would have been bright and smooth. The monuments would have stood cleanly above the desert, and the surrounding complex would have been filled with activity. Workers, priests, officials, and visitors would have moved between the different structures. The plateau would not have looked like the isolated ruins we see today. It was a functioning royal cemetery, with buildings connected by carefully planned routes. The pyramids were surrounded by temples, tombs, and settlements supporting the people who maintained them. The nearby tomb of Hetepheres provides another remarkable connection. Her burial equipment included a bed, canopy, furniture, containers, and other objects. Much of it was preserved because the burial chamber had remained sealed. These objects offer an unusually personal glimpse into royal life. The furniture is especially valuable. It shows that the royal household was not simply about monumental stone. People used beds, chairs, boxes, jewelry, and everyday objects. The woman connected with this burial was a queen, but she still lived within a world filled with ordinary possessions. The Giza cemetery also demonstrates how carefully the ancient Egyptians organized space. The placement of royal tombs, private mastabas, roads, and temples created a huge funerary landscape. Different generations added their own monuments, building around the earlier structures. Over time, the importance of Giza changed. New royal cemeteries developed elsewhere, and the center of Egyptian political power moved. The plateau gradually became less active. The priests who maintained the royal cults disappeared, and the monuments were eventually abandoned. Yet the pyramids survived. Their limestone casing was removed from many structures over later centuries, and parts of the complex were damaged. But the basic forms of the Queen's pyramids remained visible. For thousands of years, visitors continued to encounter the monuments. Some searched for treasure. Others simply wondered who had built them. The names of the queens became uncertain, while their pyramids remained. Today, the Queen's pyramids are often overshadowed by the Great Pyramid, but they are essential to understanding Giza. They show that the plateau was not created only for one king. It was a royal cemetery where kings, queens, princes, and members of the elite were commemorated together. The Sun Temple of Abu Ghurab, just south of Cairo, beyond the famous pyramids of Giza, the remains of an unusual ancient temple rise from the desert. There is no pyramid here, no burial chamber, and no giant royal tomb. Instead, there is a massive stone platform built for the sun itself. This is Abu Ghurab, the site of the Sun Temple built by the 5th dynasty pharaoh Nusere. Nusere ruled Egypt during the 25th century BC, more than 4,500 years ago. His reign came during the 5th dynasty, a period when the worship of the sun became especially important within Egypt's royal religion. The kings of this dynasty built temples dedicated directly to the solar god Ra. Niusere's temple became one of the best preserved examples. The temple was not designed like a pyramid. Instead, its central feature was an enormous open courtyard. At the far end, a massive stone obelisk-like structure once rose toward the sky. This was the Benben, a sacred symbol associated with the primeval mound and the sun. The original monument would have looked extraordinary. A huge rectangular platform surrounded the temple, while the central stone structure towered above it. There was no roof covering the main courtyard. The sunlight itself was part of the architecture. Every morning, the rising sun would enter the sacred space. The temple also contained an enormous altar. It was built from alabaster and arranged in a circular form. Offerings could be placed upon it, including food and other gifts dedicated to the solar deity. The altar remains one of the most striking features surviving at Abu Ghurab. Nearby, archaeologists discovered an enormous sunboat. It was carved in stone rather than constructed from wood. The boat represented the vessel associated with the sun god's journey across the sky. Its presence connected the temple directly with Egyptian ideas about the daily movement of the sun. The ancient Egyptians imagined the sun traveling across the heavens, then disappearing into the western horizon, before continuing its journey through the underworld at night. The temple therefore represented more than sunlight. It was connected with the eternal cycle of death, renewal, and rebirth. One of the most fascinating discoveries at Abu Ghurab is a large collection of reliefs. They show ceremonies, animals, people, and scenes connected with the king and the gods. These images provide clues about the rituals that once took place inside the temple. Among the most important scenes are depictions of the Sed festival, a royal ceremony intended to renew the king's strength and authority. The king appears participating in rituals surrounded by symbols of divine power. The temple therefore reinforced the relationship between the pharaoh, the sun, and the continued order of Egypt. Another remarkable feature is the calendar relief. It depicts festivals and religious events throughout the year, providing evidence of how the Egyptians organized their ceremonial life. The temple was therefore not only a place of worship, It was also connected with the rhythm of the Egyptian year. Imagine Abu Ghurab when it was new. The limestone would have been bright, the alabaster altar would have reflected the sunlight, and the towering central monument would have stood above the desert. Priests would have moved through the courtyard, carrying offerings, while the king's presence was represented through reliefs and ritual. Unlike a pyramid, the temple was never meant to contain the body of the king. Its purpose was different. It was a place where the king's relationship with the sun god could be maintained, and where offerings could be presented to the divine power believed to sustain the world. The location was also significant. Abu Ghurab formed part of a larger sacred landscape around Abu Sir, where several 5th dynasty kings built their pyramids and temples. The Sun Temple therefore belonged to the same royal world as the nearby pyramid complexes. Niuserre's pyramid complex at Abu Sir was connected with the Sun Temple, creating a relationship between the king's funerary cult, his pyramid, and the worship of the sun. The landscape itself became part of the religious system, but eventually the 5th dynasty came to an end. Later kings developed different religious priorities, and the importance of the solar temples declined. Abu Ghurab was no longer maintained in the same way. The buildings deteriorated, and pieces of the temple were reused elsewhere. The central monument eventually collapsed. The courtyard became buried, and the desert slowly covered the remains. For thousands of years, the Sun Temple existed mainly as scattered ruins beneath the sand. Modern archaeology began revealing the structure again. Excavations uncovered the altar, the boat, the reliefs, and the enormous platform. Piece by piece, researchers reconstructed how the temple had once worked. What makes Abu Ghurab so fascinating is that the ancient Egyptians created a temple where the sun itself was part of the experience. There was no dark central sanctuary dominating the complex. Instead, the main sacred space was open to the sky. The architecture was designed around light. The surviving altar makes that idea especially clear. It stands in the open courtyard, where offerings could be placed beneath the sun. The monument was not simply built to look impressive. It was designed around a religious idea that the sun was a living divine force. The grave of the wrestler at Aspendos, near the ancient city of Aspendos in southern Turkey. Archaeologists uncovered a grave that may belong to an ancient athlete. Inside a simple stone sarcophagus, they found a human skeleton and several silver coins, but these were not ordinary coins. Each one carried the image of 2 wrestlers locked in combat. The discovery raises the possibility that the person buried here may have been a professional wrestler more than 2,000 years ago. The grave dates to roughly 475 to 300 BC, so at a period when Aspendos was an important city in the ancient region of Pamphylia. The city stood near the Eurymedon River, not far from the Mediterranean coast. Its position helped it become an important center for trade, agriculture, and regional political life. Aspendos was also famous for something else: sport. The city possessed large athletic facilities, including a stadium where events such as foot races, javelin throwing, and wrestling could take place. Wrestling was not simply entertainment. It was an important part of Greek athletic culture, and Aspendos appears to have embraced that tradition strongly. The newly discovered grave was found in a cemetery outside the ancient city. The burial itself was relatively simple. Large stone slabs formed a box-like sarcophagus inside which the skeleton had been placed. There was no enormous monument announcing the identity of the person buried there. Instead, the clues came from the objects left beside the body. Among those objects were silver staters bearing the famous Aspendos wrestler design. 2 naked athletes are shown gripping each other, their bodies leaning forward, as though frozen in the middle of a real match. The image was one of the city's best-known coin types during the classical period. On the other side of the coins, a completely different scene appears. A slinger is shown preparing to release his weapon. With the city's distinctive triskele symbol nearby, the combination of wrestler and slinger became strongly associated with Aspendian coinage. These silver coins were produced for generations. But why were these particular coins placed in this grave? That is the question that makes the discovery so interesting. The coins could have been personal possessions, or they could have had a symbolic connection with the deceased. Their wrestler imagery makes an athletic connection possible, but archaeologists are careful not to call the individual a wrestler with certainty. A coin cannot prove someone's profession. The person may have admired wrestling, worked in the athletic world, or simply possessed coins that happened to carry the city's famous design. More evidence is needed. Researchers may be able to study the skeleton for physical characteristics associated with athletic activity, including healed injuries or unusual muscular development. Still, The possibility is fascinating. If the individual really was an athlete, these coins may have been deliberately chosen for the burial. Perhaps they represented the person's identity, his achievements, or his connection with Aspendos. Wrestling had a long tradition in the Greek world. Athletes trained intensely, often from a young age. Competitions could bring considerable prestige, and successful athletes could become famous within their communities. A victorious wrestler was not simply a strong man. He could become a symbol of civic pride. Aspendos coins reinforce that idea. The city continued producing wrestler staters for a remarkably long period, with the type appearing throughout much of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. Their repeated use suggests that wrestling imagery held lasting importance within the city's identity. Imagine Aspendos during the lifetime of the person buried. Here, the streets would have been busy, merchants would have moved goods through the city, and athletes could have trained in the city's sporting facilities. The stadium would have filled with spectators during competitions, and somewhere among that crowd, a young athlete may have dreamed of becoming a champion. The city itself was prosperous enough to produce its own silver coinage. Aspendos began minting coins by around the 5th century BC, and its staters circulated widely beyond the city itself. This tells us that Aspendos was connected to a much larger economic world. The wrestler coins are particularly valuable for another reason. They preserve an image of ancient athletic practice. The two competitors are shown facing each other, gripping one another's arms, their bodies positioned for close combat. It is a tiny scene, but it captures a sport that was already centuries old. The newly discovered burial therefore connects several aspects of ancient life: sport, money, identity, and death. A person who may have spent his life competing physically was eventually placed inside a stone tomb with silver coins beside him. But the grave still refuses to tell us his name. There is no surviving inscription identifying the deceased. No written record tells us where he came from, how successful he was, or how he died. The skeleton may eventually provide more clues, but for now his identity remains uncertain. That uncertainty is what makes the discovery so human. We can see the objects he carried. We can see the city where he lived, and we can understand the culture that celebrated wrestling. But the person himself remains almost completely anonymous. Centuries later, Aspendos would become famous for its enormous Roman theater, one of the best-preserved theaters in the ancient Mediterranean, but beneath the better-known ruins, the older Greek city is still being uncovered. The new cemetery discovery is another reminder that Aspendos was already an important center long before the Roman monuments appeared. Today, the ancient city continues to be investigated by archaeologists. Excavations are revealing new buildings, objects, coins, and evidence from different periods of Aspendos' long history. The village the desert sand swallowed alive in the middle of Chile's Atacama Desert. A forgotten village was slowly disappearing beneath the sand. Not destroyed by an army, not abandoned after a single disaster, but gradually swallowed by the desert itself. For centuries, only small parts of its walls remained visible above the dunes. Beneath them, an entire ancient settlement was still waiting. This is Aldea de Tulur, one of the oldest known sedentary archaeological settlements in northern Chile. Tulur lies near San Pedro de Atacama, between the Cordillera de la Sal and the northern edge of the Salar de Atacama. Today, the landscape is extremely dry, but thousands of years ago, the area around the settlement was supported by water from the San Pedro River that made agriculture, animal herding, and permanent settlement possible in the middle of the desert. The village was built from earth and mud, with houses arranged in unusual circular forms. The structures were connected by narrow passages, courtyards, and shared spaces. Instead of a collection of isolated houses, Tulur developed into an interconnected settlement. Archaeological research suggests that the settlement began around 400 BC, although dating evidence places its occupation across a much longer period. Some of the structures were used during the first centuries of the Christian era, and later areas of the settlement were associated with burial activity. The circular architecture was perfectly suited to the environment. Thick earthen walls provided insulation, helping reduce the enormous temperature changes between the hot desert days and freezing nights. The curved walls also offered protection from the powerful desert winds. The builders were adapting their homes to one of the harshest environments on Earth. But Tulur was not isolated. Archaeological materials show connections with communities across the wider Andes, including areas of the highlands, the Argentine Northwest, and the Pacific coast. Goods and ideas could move through the desert, carried by people and llama caravans. Pottery, stone tools, animal remains, shell ornaments, wood, textiles, and other materials have been recovered from the settlement. Together, They reveal a community involved in farming, craft production, animal herding, and long-distance exchange. Imagine Tulur when it was still alive. The desert would have surrounded the settlement, but the village itself would have been full of activity. People preparing food, working clay, caring for animals, moving between circular rooms, and carrying goods through the narrow passages. The nearby river made the difference. Water allowed the inhabitants to cultivate crops, raise animals, and maintain a permanent settlement. Tulur was essentially an oasis community, a small human world surrounded by one of the driest landscapes on Earth. But the environment was changing over centuries. The climate became increasingly dry, and the landscape around Tulur became more vulnerable to advancing dunes. The sand began moving toward the settlement. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began covering the walls. The process was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the village vanished. Instead, sand accumulated year after year, generation after generation. Walls disappeared, rooms filled, and the settlement gradually sank beneath the desert. Eventually, much of Tulur was hidden. Only sections of the ancient walls remained visible. While the majority of the settlement disappeared beneath the dunes, the village had effectively been swallowed by the landscape. And that strange burial helped preserve it. The dry desert environment protected many materials from decay. Objects that would normally disappear in wetter environments remained beneath the sand, waiting for archaeologists to find them. The site was first identified by the Jesuit priest and archaeologist Gustavo Lepage in 1956. He described an ancient settlement that was almost completely covered by sand, with grinding stones and other tools buried within it. Later excavations revealed just how extensive Tulur really was. Archaeologists began uncovering circular structures, walls, burial evidence, and layers of domestic activity. The more sand they removed, the more complete the ancient settlement became. One of the most fascinating discoveries was the way the village had developed over time. The interconnected structures were not all built at once. The settlement expanded, changed, and was eventually used for different purposes. Its architecture preserves a record of generations of occupation. Some areas were later used as a cemetery. Human remains were discovered within certain structures, along with pottery and other burial objects. This suggests that the relationship between the living and the settlement continued even after parts of Tulur were no longer functioning as ordinary homes. But the desert continued moving. Even after the archaeological discovery, the dunes remained a threat. Wind, occasional rain, salt, and erosion continued to affect the fragile earthen walls. The same environment that preserved Tulur is also slowly destroying it. That makes the site particularly fragile. Unlike stone temples, these buildings were made largely from earth. Once exposed, the walls are vulnerable to weather and erosion. Archaeologists therefore face a difficult problem. How do you uncover a site without exposing it to the forces that buried it? Today, only part of the original settlement is visible, but the remaining structures reveal an extraordinary pattern. Circular rooms connected together, creating a maze-like village of ancient earth. Beyond it, the desert stretches toward the distant mountains. Standing here, it is difficult to imagine that this was once a living community. There are no streets filled with people now, no animals, no smoke rising from cooking fires, only walls, sand, and silence. Yet those walls preserve ordinary lives. Someone shaped the clay, someone built the house, someone prepared food inside, someone walked through the narrow passage, and someone eventually left the settlement behind. Aldea de Tulur is remarkable because the desert did not simply destroy the village, it buried it. For more than 1,000 years, sand covered the homes, the walls, the objects, and the traces of everyday life. The ancient city hidden in the Costa Rican rainforest. Guayabo lies near the modern city of Turrialba, on the slopes of Turrialba volcano. The archaeological area covers roughly 20 hectares, although only a small portion of the wider site has been excavated. Beneath the forest, much more of the ancient settlement remains unexplored. The settlement was occupied for an extraordinarily long period. Evidence places human activity here from around 1000 BC to AD 1400, a span of roughly 2,400 years. But the monumental structures visible today developed mainly during the later period of occupation, when Guayabo became an important regional center. The first thing that catches the eye are the enormous circular stone foundations. These were the bases of buildings, probably supporting wooden structures with conical roofs. Some foundations are large, others are smaller, and together they form part of a carefully organized settlement. But Guayabo was not simply a village. The settlement contained plazas, stone-paved areas, stairways, retaining walls, and long roads extending through the landscape. Some of the roads continue for several kilometers, connecting different parts of the ancient settlement. Then there is the water system. This may be one of Guayabo's most impressive achievements. Ancient builders constructed channels, aqueducts, and stone-lined water features designed to move and control water through the settlement. Some channels were open, while others passed beneath the ground. Water could be directed towards storage tanks, where it could be collected and controlled. Other channels helped drain excess water away from the settlement. This was especially important in a region where heavy rainfall could quickly turn the landscape into flowing water. The builders had to work with the environment, not simply build against it. Imagine Guayabo when it was still occupied. The rainforest would have surrounded the settlement, but the stone plazas would have been busy. People moving between houses, workers maintaining the roads, water flowing through channels, and important ceremonies taking place in the central areas. The settlement would have looked completely different from the quiet ruins we see today. The architecture suggests that Guayabo was an important political and religious center. Archaeologists believe a powerful local leader or chief may have controlled the settlement, along with smaller communities in the surrounding region. The size and organization of the site suggest that different groups of specialists lived and worked here. But the people of Guayabo left no written history explaining their society. There are no surviving chronicles, no royal biographies, and no complete explanation of why the settlement was organized in this particular way. Instead, the stones have to tell the story. Among the most mysterious objects are the petroglyphs. Large stones were carved with strange designs, including spirals, geometric patterns, and images that appear to represent animals. Some stones contain symbols whose meaning remains uncertain. They may have communicated information, religious ideas, or connections with particular groups. One famous carved stone is associated with an image resembling a spiral or swirling form. Others contain animal-like figures, including possible representations of felines, but without a written system we can fully understand. The exact meaning of these carvings remains unknown. The site's location is also fascinating. Guayabo sits between deep river valleys, on a high plateau surrounded by forest. This position may have provided natural advantages, while also creating serious engineering challenges. The builders had to move stone, create level surfaces, and manage water across uneven volcanic terrain. They responded by modifying the landscape. Terraces, retaining walls, stone surfaces, and carefully positioned structures helped transform the uneven ground into a functioning settlement. The architecture was integrated into the surrounding environment. The roads are particularly impressive. Large stones were arranged into paved surfaces, creating stable routes through the settlement. Some roads appear to have connected Guayabo with distant areas, although the full extent and purpose of every route remains a subject of research. These roads may have carried people, goods, and perhaps groups traveling for ceremonial purposes. They also demonstrate that the settlement was not isolated. Guayabo was connected with a wider landscape, and its influence may have extended far beyond the structures visible today. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned, and this is where one of Guayabo's greatest mysteries begins. Archaeologists know that people were no longer living here by around AD 1400, but the exact reason remains uncertain. There is no single proven explanation. Disease has been suggested, along with warfare, internal conflict, environmental changes, and other pressures that may have affected the community, but there is not enough evidence to identify one definite cause. The people simply disappeared from the settlement, long before Spanish conquest reached the region. The rainforest slowly reclaimed the site. Vegetation covered the stone. Trees grew around the foundations, and centuries of rainfall buried parts of the ancient settlement beneath soil and plants. Guayabo became hidden inside the landscape. The first recorded archaeological investigations began in the late 19th century, but systematic scientific research only began much later. From the late 1960s, archaeologist Carlos Aguilar Piedra led major investigations that helped reveal the scale and complexity of the site. And even today, only a fraction of Guayabo has been excavated. Large portions of the archaeological area remain beneath the forest. Modern technologies such as ground-penetrating radar are now helping researchers investigate areas without immediately disturbing the ground. That means the visible ruins may represent only a small part of the original settlement. There could still be buried structures, roads, water channels, homes, and objects waiting beneath the vegetation. The ancient city is not completely understood, Not even close. The stone that was said to choose Ireland's kings, Tara, is not simply one ancient monument. It is an entire archaeological landscape, filled with burial mounds, earthwork enclosures, passage tombs, and ceremonial structures. More than 30 monuments are visible across the hill, while archaeological surveys have identified many more beneath the ground. The oldest visible monument is the Mound of the Hostages, a Neolithic passage tomb dating back roughly 5,000 years. Long before the legendary kings of Ireland, people were already coming to this hill, but Tara became especially important during the Iron Age and continued to hold enormous symbolic importance into the early medieval period. The hill became associated with the high kings of Ireland, although the archaeological evidence suggests that Tara was more complex than a simple royal palace. It appears to have been a place of ceremony, gathering, burial, and royal inauguration. At the center of this landscape is a large enclosure known as Roth na Riog, the Fort of the Kings. It surrounds the summit of Tara, creating a huge oval boundary almost a kilometer in circumference, but there is something unusual about its construction. The ditch is on the inside, while the bank is on the outside. That arrangement makes little sense as a defensive fortification. Instead, archaeologists believe the enclosure may have marked out a sacred or ceremonial space. Inside this great enclosure, another monument rises from the grass. It is known as the Farad, the royal seat. Atop it stands the stone that became one of Ireland's most famous symbols, Lia Fáil. According to medieval Irish tradition, the stone possessed a remarkable ability. When the rightful king placed his foot upon it, the stone was said to cry out. A supernatural voice would announce that the true ruler had arrived. The story transformed an ordinary-looking standing stone into something much more powerful, a symbol of legitimate kingship. The legend became deeply connected with Irish mythology. Lia Fáil was described as one of the treasures associated with the Tuatha De Danann, a supernatural people in medieval Irish tradition. The stone was therefore not simply a royal object. It belonged to a much older mythical world, where sacred stones could recognize rulers and confirm their right to reign. But here, the archaeology becomes more complicated. The stone standing at Tara today may not actually be the original Lia Fáil. Its identification has been questioned by archaeologists and historians, and its history appears to be considerably more complicated than the legend suggests. The present stone is a pale, pillar-like stone standing on the Forad. It is roughly 1.5 meters high, and its surface carries faint traces of later markings. But earlier accounts suggest that the stone may originally have stood somewhere else on the hill, according to one tradition. It once stood near the Mound of the Hostages. In 1824, the stone was reportedly moved to its present position. One explanation connects the move with commemorating those who died during the 1798 Battle of Tara 8. Because of this complicated history, archaeologists cannot simply assume that the stone now standing on the Forad is unquestionably the ancient inauguration stone. That uncertainty does not make Tara less fascinating. In fact, it makes the site even more interesting. Because here, myth, archaeology, medieval literature, and modern history have become tangled together. It can be difficult to separate what actually happened from what later generations believed happened. The archaeological evidence does tell us that Tara was important for ceremonial kingship. The monuments around the summit were associated with royal inauguration, and the landscape appears to have been carefully arranged for symbolic purposes. But there is no simple archaeological record describing exactly how every inauguration ceremony took place. Imagine approaching Tara during the early medieval period. The hill would have looked very different from today. The great earthworks would have been freshly maintained. Timber structures may have stood within some enclosures, and gatherings could have brought large numbers of people to the summit. At the center, the royal ceremonies would have taken place. The king was not simply receiving a crown. Kingship was a public act. The ruler had to demonstrate legitimacy, connection with the land, and the support of powerful people. A sacred landscape like Tara gave that ceremony enormous meaning. The surrounding monuments added to the symbolism. The Mound of the Hostages preserved much older burials. The Fort of the Kings enclosed the summit. The royal seat occupied the center, and the standing stone marked the place traditionally connected with inauguration. Thousands of years of human activity had accumulated on the same hill. Tara also appears in early Irish Christian history. According to tradition, St. Patrick visited the area during the 5th century. By the early Christian period, Tara's importance was increasingly transformed from a living center of pagan kingship into a powerful symbol of Ireland's past. The old halls and royal buildings eventually disappeared. Wood decayed, earthworks weathered, and the people who knew the original ceremonies passed away. But the stories survived. Medieval writers recorded legends about Tara, giving names and explanations to monuments whose original purposes were sometimes already forgotten. This is why some names at Tara can be misleading. Cormac's house, the banqueting hall, the Rath of the Synods, and the royal seat all sound as though their purposes are obvious. But archaeology tells a more complicated story. Some monuments are much older than the medieval traditions that later gave them their names. The same is true of Leofol. The legend is powerful, but the physical stone has its own history, and perhaps that is what makes it so compelling. Whether or not the stone standing here today is the original, generations of people believed that this was the place where Ireland's kings were recognized. The stone therefore became more than an archaeological object. It became a symbol, a connection between the living ruler, the ancient landscape, and the mythical history of Ireland. The monastery that became a city of learning, on the banks of the River Shannon, among the quiet fields of County Offaly, the remains of an ancient monastery still rise from the Irish landscape. Stone crosses, round towers, churches, and hundreds of carved grave slabs cover the ground. But Clonmacnoise was once much more than a monastery. For centuries, it was one of the great centers of learning, craftsmanship, trade, and religion in medieval Ireland. The story begins in the 6th century, when Stank Ciaran founded a monastery here around AD 548. The location was remarkably important. Clonmacnoise stood beside the River Shannon, Ireland's great north-south waterway, and near one of the major east-west routes crossing the central part of the island. It was almost a natural crossroads. That location helped transform the small monastery into something much larger. People could arrive by river, travel across the country, exchange goods, and visit the religious community. Over time, Clonmacnoise became a major center of learning. Students and scholars were drawn here, and the monastery developed a reputation that extended far beyond the surrounding countryside. The settlement would have looked very different from the ruins visible today. Most of the buildings were made from timber, including homes and other structures used by the community. Those buildings disappeared long ago, but archaeology has revealed traces of them beneath the ground. The stone churches we see today came later. As the monastery grew, so did its population. Clonmacnoise eventually began to resemble a small town, rather than an isolated monastery. Craft workers, traders, religious communities, students, pilgrims, and local families all became part of the settlement. It was a place where religious and ordinary life existed side by side. The river was essential. Boats could carry people and goods along the Shannon, connecting Clonmacnoise with communities far beyond the monastery. The nearby land routes provided another connection together. They made this remote-looking location one of the busiest crossroads in early medieval Ireland. The monastery also attracted royal attention. Clonmacnoise stood near the meeting point of important kingdoms, and rulers from both sides of the Shannon supported the monastery. Powerful kings were buried here, giving the site an additional political importance. It was a religious center, but it was also connected to the ruling world of medieval Ireland. The remains of that world are still visible. The site contains a cathedral, several churches, round towers, high crosses, and an extraordinary collection of early Christian grave slabs. More than 700 grave slabs have been recorded at the monastery. Each one represents a person who once belonged to this community. Among the most famous monuments is the Cross of the Scriptures. The original cross dates to the 10th century, and its surface is covered with intricate carved scenes, figures, biblical imagery, and decorative patterns were carefully cut into the stone. The cross was not simply a marker. It communicated religious stories to everyone who stood before it. Another remarkable monument is the North Cross, dating to around AD 800. Its decoration includes imagery connected with early Irish artistic traditions, including intricate patterns and figures. These crosses show how skilled the craftsmen of Clonmacnoise had become. The monastery was also a place of writing. Books and manuscripts were produced and studied in Irish monasteries, and Clonmacnoise participated in that wider intellectual tradition. Scholars could come here to study religious texts, history, language, and other forms of knowledge. But learning was not the only activity. Craftsmanship was extremely important. Archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence for metalworking and other forms of production. Objects had to be made, repaired, and traded. Clonmacnoise was therefore a working community, not simply a collection of churches. One discovery gives a particularly interesting glimpse into this activity. A hidden hoard of 31 Hiberno-Norse silver pennies was found within the monastic enclosure, along with a bronze ingot and part of a gold earring. The coins were deposited around AD 10,065 to 10,095. Their presence shows that Clonmacnoise was connected with the wider economic world of the Viking Age. The Viking connection is especially interesting. Hiberno-Norse coins were produced within the Irish and Norse world, and their presence at Clonmacnoise shows that the monastery was not isolated from changing political and commercial networks. People, money, and goods were moving through Ireland, and Clonmacnoise was directly connected to that movement. The monastery also experienced violence. Its wealth and importance made it a valuable target. Over the centuries, Clonmacnoise suffered attacks, political upheaval, and repeated periods of destruction. Yet the community repeatedly recovered. The monastery continued to survive through changing political conditions. One of its round towers provides another glimpse into this turbulent history. A tower constructed in the 12th century was struck by lightning, and the upper portion collapsed. Rather than simply abandoning the fallen stone, builders reused parts of it. Some of the finely carved masonry was incorporated into another tower connected with St. Finghin's Church. This kind of reuse tells us something about medieval builders. Stone was valuable. Even damaged monuments could provide useful material. The ruins we see today, therefore, sometimes contain pieces of several different generations, built into one another. Nearby stands the Nunes Church, completed in the 12th century. Its doorway and chancel arch contain some of the finest surviving examples of Irish Romanesque carving. The building demonstrates how artistic styles were changing, as Irish craftsmen interacted with wider European architectural traditions. By the later medieval period, Clonmacnoise was still an important religious center, but the political world around it had changed. New powers had arrived in Ireland, and the old Gaelic kingdoms were increasingly challenged. The monastery continued, but its position within the wider country was no longer the same. Eventually, the settlement declined. The buildings fell into ruin, the timber structures disappeared. The stone structures scattered across the Arabian desert. These structures are part of one of the least understood archaeological landscapes in Arabia. They are scattered across enormous areas of Saudi Arabia, from volcanic fields to desert plains to the edges of ancient oases. Some form dense clusters, while others stand alone. Together, they represent a vast prehistoric building tradition. UNESCO World Heritage Center. 1. For a long time, archaeologists knew very little about them. Local Bedouin communities had known about many of these structures for generations, but modern archaeology only began seriously recognizing their scale during the 20th century. Aerial photography changed everything. Structures that looked like piles of stones from the ground suddenly became enormous geometric designs when viewed from above. UNESCO World Heritage Center, A1. One of the most unusual types is known as a mustatil. The Arabic word refers to a rectangle, and that is exactly what these structures resemble. Long stone walls extend across the desert, sometimes for hundreds of meters. At one end, there is usually a larger platform or enclosed area. From the air, they can look almost like giant stone gates lying across the landscape. Some mustatils are enormous. The longest known examples extend for more than 500 meters, although many are considerably smaller. They were constructed from locally available stone, with parallel walls enclosing a long central space. At one end, a raised structure or platform was created. But the real mystery is their purpose. For decades, archaeologists could not determine exactly why these enormous structures were built. They were too large to be ordinary houses, and their unusual shape did not immediately resemble conventional settlements. Then excavations began providing clues. One excavated mustatil east of Alula, around 140 meters long, contained evidence suggesting that the structure had a ritual purpose. Archaeologists found animal remains, including cattle, around a stone feature known as a beetle. The evidence suggests that ceremonies may have taken place inside these enormous open-air monuments. PubMed Central PMC 2. The dates are equally remarkable. Some mustatils appear to have been constructed during the 6th millennium BC, making them roughly 7,000 years old. That places them among the earliest monumental structures known from Arabia. UNESCO World Heritage Center, 1. At that time, the Arabian Peninsula looked very different. The region experienced what archaeologists call the Arabian humid period. Parts of Arabia received considerably more rainfall than today, creating grasslands, lakes, and environments capable of supporting larger populations of animals and people. Communities moved through these landscapes, herding animals, hunting, and making increasing use of domesticated cattle. Cattle appear to have been particularly important to some of the rituals associated with the Mustatils. Their remains suggest that animals were not simply sources of food, they could also have carried religious meaning. But the Mustatils are only one type of Saudi Arabian stone structure. There are also enormous kites, long structures that spread outward across the landscape. These are generally interpreted as animal traps. Their walls could guide wild animals toward enclosed areas, allowing hunters to capture large numbers of animals. Some of these hunting structures are enormous, building them would have required considerable labor, and the people who created them may have returned to the same locations repeatedly. The investment suggests that these were not random piles of stones. They were carefully planned constructions. Then there are the pendant structures from above. Some resemble enormous necklaces laid across the desert. A circular stone feature forms one end, while a long tail of stones extends outward. Many appear to have funerary connections, although not every example has been fully understood. Another remarkable group can be found at Rajajil near Sakaka in northern Saudi Arabia. Here, tall standing stones rise from the desert in groups. Some of the pillars reach around 2 to 4 meters high, and individual stones can weigh several tons. The arrangement of these stones has led to different interpretations. Some researchers have suggested astronomical significance because several groups follow a broadly north-south orientation. Others have pointed toward funerary or ritual functions. Burials have also been identified in the wider area. The exact purpose remains uncertain. What makes Rajajil particularly fascinating is the effort required to create it. The stones were brought together, shaped, and raised into position. People without modern machinery somehow organized enormous pieces of rock into carefully arranged monuments. And Rajajil is only one site, across Saudi Arabia. The number of prehistoric stone structures may be extraordinary. A preliminary estimate cited by UNESCO suggests around 1 million structures across the country. That figure includes many different types, and research is still developing. The true number and chronology remain subjects of investigation. The scale changes the way we think about prehistoric Arabia. For a long time, the desert was imagined as a barrier, a place where permanent communities could not easily survive. But these structures tell another story. People were repeatedly returning to these landscapes, building, hunting, herding, burying their dead, and creating places with meaning. The landscape itself became part of their culture. A stone structure could mark a burial, a ritual location, a hunting ground, or perhaps a place connected with movement and territory. Different structures may have served completely different purposes, and that is one reason archaeologists are cautious. It would be easy to give every strange stone shape one dramatic explanation, but the evidence does not support that. Some were probably funerary, some were hunting structures, some appear ritual, and others remain unexplained. The biggest mystery is not necessarily one individual monument, it is the entire system. Why did prehistoric communities across such enormous distances repeatedly build geometric structures from stone? How did the knowledge spread? And why did certain designs appear in different regions? The similarities are striking. Related forms occur across Arabia.